I want to welcome Sullivan Fortner to the National Jazz Museum and Harlem Speaks. It's great to see you.
Yeah, man. Good to see you, man. It's been a minute since we had a chance to talk and hang.
Absolutely. But I've been hearing you in person, or I should say in person, hearing you playing on recordings and various things. It's great to see you. I'd like to start just by covering the basics like we do in all of our interviews. Where and when were you born?
I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, December 29th, 1986.
All right. And have the Fortners been in New Orleans a long time? How did they wind up in New Orleans?
Well, my mom grew up in New Orleans. She was born and raised there. My dad is from a little town right outside of Baton Rouge, right outside of Donaldsonville, Louisiana, actually. It's a town called Belrose. It's one of those little cities that's like one street, one stoplight, you know, real country town, very family oriented. Him and my mom met at Nicholls State University in Thibodaux, Louisiana. And then when they got married, I think they decided to live in New Orleans East to be with my mom and her family. And yeah, I was born a year after they got married, maybe a year some change after they got married. And yeah.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
Yeah, I have two younger sisters. So I'm the first of the Mohicans. And then my sister was born 3 years later, Ashton. She was born 3 years later, and Amanda was born 3 years after that. I think my mom had an obsession with the number 29. And so Ashton was born October 29. Amanda broke it. She was born November 14th. So she just had her birthday. And December. So October, November, December. All supposed to have been born on the 29th. Amanda came a little early. So, yeah.
Can you describe to us the New Orleans that you were born into, and what part of New Orleans did you live in? And then the next question will be, how did music come into your life? But I'd like to hear about the neighborhood, and I'm curious, does it still exist?
The neighborhood?
Because of the hurricane, I guess I'm asking. I mean, that's the only reason.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's still there. We're not there anymore, but it's still there. When I was 4 years old, my parents moved from New Orleans.
Hey, Sullivan, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm seeing from your eyes down, but I'm not seeing the whole face.
Oh, okay. Is that better?
Which is a look, I have to say, but it's. I'll ask that question again.
Okay.
When I ask about the neighborhood, I guess I'm just saying because you were born long before Katrina, and I'm just wondering whether the neighborhood still exists.
Oh yeah, the neighborhood still exists. I grew up basically uptown New Orleans, off Broad and Napoleon Street called General Pershing Street. 3714 was my grandmother's neighborhood, and was her house, and we spent a lot of time there. When I was 4, my mom and my dad moved out of the city of New Orleans to a town called La Place, Louisiana. And I did everything in New Orleans other than sleep. The only place that I slept was in LaPlace. So we would drive like every morning at like 6:30 to go to school, and you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Do those types of things. But the neighborhood is still intact and still fine.
How did music come into your life?
Oh, it's been in my life since for a very, very, very long time. Since probably, I remember my mom taking me to like, she would tell me she would take us to like choir rehearsals. Like as soon as she got off maternity leave, she would just go to like, because we were all a part of church, Baptist church. So, you know, anybody know anything about that situation? We were at church about sometimes 6-7 days a week. And we were always, singing. It was always choir rehearsal. If there wasn't choir rehearsal, there'd be rehearsal at my mom's house or my grandmother's house. My whole family sings, everyone. My mom sings, her brothers and sisters sing. I have some people on my dad's side that sing. My dad can sing a little bit. Yeah, all my sisters sing, so yeah, it's in the family for sure.
How did actually playing music start to come your way? Was there a piano at home? Did you just start? How did it happen?
Well, incidentally, it started in church pretty much. So the choir director, who I had a crush on, I would just sit and watch her every Sunday. And then one day, and after church was over, I would go home and I would bang out the rhythms that I would hear on the countertops, and certain songs I would sing and kind of like bang out the rhythms. And my mom was like, this boy's crazy. He don't want to run around and play with the other kids. He wants to sit and listen to the organist and sit and watch her. And I think one day the Jeopardy theme song came on television. And by that time, my mom had brought like one of those little Fisher-Price pianos with the different colors, because she was tired of me banging on the TV while she was trying to watch Young and the Restless and stuff like that. So the Jeopardy theme song came on television, and I played the melody back after like 2 hearings, and it scared her. My mom minored in music in college. She was minored in voice, so she noticed that there's a note where there's a half step in the song. And I heard the half step, but I knew the half step wasn't there, so I left it blank. And so for my mom, that really tripped her out, because that was like, okay, my son has an ear to hear that the note that's there isn't on the piano, so he left it blank. So he played it. She said, play it again. And I played it like about 5 times. And then she called my cousin, who was a music teacher in New Orleans. I played it for him over the phone. And she brought me to his house the very next day. I played it for him live because he couldn't believe it. And then that was it. That's just been music since then.
So did that lead to lessons?
No. Okay. It led to kind of maybe some lessons with my cousin, because he's a multi-instrumentalist, but he's not a pianist. His main instrument is saxophone. Yeah, so he would just like show me like different notes on the keys, like what the notes were called, like if he saw the note on the music staff, what would it look like, quarter note, quarter rest, half note, half, things like that. But he never really showed me. In fact, I didn't have a formal piano lesson until I got to high school. So it was probably like 13, 14 years old when I had my first formal piano lesson with a piano teacher. Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, are you starting to work out tunes and to play in church, or to play pop tunes you heard your friends singing, or play for your mom or your dad, or?
Yeah. So let's see. Since being like 4 or 5, I was, after watching her for a long time, they finally gave me the courage to play for my grandmother, who was singing a solo. So I got on the organ at 7 years old and played for her. And she kicked me off because I couldn't keep time. So they really but the organist at the church was like really like inspired to teach me some things. So I would like start by playing like the last song of the church service. And by then my ear was kind of like beginning to kind of just pick things up. And I was able to see things, and I was watching her draw bar settings and watching her hand shapes and things like that. So the last song in the church service led to the last two songs in the church service. And then that led to backing up the preacher. And then that led to one choir song. And it led to two choir songs. And then by the time I was 9, I was playing for the youth choir, the whole service. I played the full service for the youth choir, and then the male chorus. And then 10 years old, I was the main musician of the church. Mm-hmm.
So at this time, so this is the mid 90s, is the pop music of the day, the popular music that the kids are listening to and that's on the radio, is that also coming across the transom?
Absolutely. I mean, my dad was the R&B junkie, and my mom would play it sometimes, you know. So I remember like being engrossed from like Earth, Wind and Fire and Stevie Wonder stuff, all the way up to like Tony Braxton and Whitney Houston, and Brian McKnight and people like that. The whole R&B circle was stuff that I just remember listening to. And then, you know, I watched a lot of television. So I used to like to watch, you know, the Family Matters, Saved by the Bell, and all of those shows. And they would have all of these. Sometimes they would have different artists, you know. So I would kind of learn songs from them, and I would learn about different artists from that. And then that would kind of spiral into like a whole research mode.
I'm curious because, you know, jazz education has changed so much and the way that things are. So if you didn't sit down and take a quote unquote piano lesson until high school, although you had these lessons in the church and you're playing for people, there's no better lesson than that. I'm curious, how did you start to think about harmony? Is this totally just by osmosis? This goes here, this goes there. I mean,
a lot of it honestly was just watching. I mean, there were a couple of occasions that really stuck out to my mind. There were a few people that would come to the church that kind of knew some jazz harmony. I remember this blind guy from St. Louis that came by and played organ. His name was Tony. He played like crazy. And I remember like watching him. He only played chords with one hand, and he would walk the bass line with his left hand. So he was my introduction to somebody like a Jimmy Smith kind of style of playing on the organ at church, which was wild. So, and it was over my head. So I was just like, well, I don't know what that was. But I remember at 12 years old, there was a guy named Ronald Markham who came to the church. And Ronald was amazing. He kind of went through all of the different styles. He went to classical music. He played some jazz. He played some Latin music and all this stuff on the organ. And I'm like, man, how do you hear harmony like this? The chords you're playing is crazy. You know what I mean? And by that time, I was starting to listen to people who were a little bit more advanced in harmony for gospel music, like people like Take Six, people like Walter Hawkins, people like Andre Crouch and John P. Key, Hezekiah, people like that, you know. I'm starting to really kind of get into that music. And there was some chords I couldn't really figure out, but I can hear like the triad function inside of it. And then that kind of helped me figure out and build on upper extensions. And I didn't realize what I was doing. You know what I mean? But he showed me how to put those things. Ronald kind of was my introduction to actually putting those things together and reharmonization and all of that stuff. And he was like, man, you need to go to New Orleans Center for Creative Arts. You'll learn all of that stuff. So, yeah.
You know, there's something beautifully mysterious about it in a certain kind of sense. It's like one thing to learn, like, here's all the chords and all 12 keys, and this is how you play a 13 flat 5, and it's like, it's up in the head, but like you actually never went down the road of either figuring it out for yourself or hearing it.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like that's what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, my whole musical ear development was partially that and my mom. So like my mom, ear training for me was head gestures. It was like a head game that my mom would play. It's kind of like the way we would communicate harmonies. It said, no, it's not that chord, it's this chord right here. That's something funny. And then I would figure it out based on her head and face and be like, yeah, that's right. Or, you know, it's like, no, it's the other one. It doesn't go there, it goes the other way. Yeah, that's it. You know. Mm-hmm. So I learned harmony that way too. A lot of our time was kind of, because we lived kind of far away from New Orleans.
Right.
A lot of the time was spent traveling back and forth from home. My mom really, even if my mom wanted to take us to places to listen to music and to, like, you know, check things out, it kind of wasn't possible in those days.
Right.
Yeah.
So are you playing music in school too, or is it just in the church?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, I'm playing the schools. By then I'm playing for, you know, middle school choir, high school choirs, things like that. But it was mainly strictly gospel until I got to high school. New Orleans Center for Creative Arts is just like this. It's a historic music in all arts, pretty much. It does drama, visual arts, creative writing, music in all divisions, opera, classical music, and jazz. And the teachers were like amazing. Like when I first got there, the teacher I had was Clyde Kerr Jr. And Clyde was Donna Harrison's teacher. He was Urban Mayfield's teacher. He was Nicholas Payton's teacher. And Christian Scott gave me my first gig when I was there. We played for a gala that they had for NOCA. There's a fundraiser for the brand new building that they had just opened up. And he gave me my first gig. And, you know, I didn't know, I was back in the day, I wore my school uniform because I didn't know we had to dress up, you know what I mean? So it was a real training ground, you know what I mean? It was a real training ground. It was a real exposure to classical music. I had never heard Chopin before, or Bach, or any of those people. And, you know, to be in an environment like that with peers your same age and, you know, experiencing it at the same time as you, maybe not a whole lot, maybe a few people who had a similar background to you as far as growing up in church and just learning in church. But for the most part, a lot of people in the jazz department particularly got their experiences playing in the street, playing in, you know, second line bands and playing in R&B bands and stuff like that. So they were coming from a completely different area and learning from them too. And it was a really, really special time. Peter Martin was my first piano teacher. Peter, who, you know, plays with Diane Reeves. By then he was living in New Orleans, and he taught me and him and I want to say a lady by the name of Dean Curtis, who was my classical teacher for like the whole 2 or 3 years I was there. Really, really cool lady. And the jazz department changed. So the first year was Peter Martin. Second year I was there was a guy named Michael Esno, who is an incredible arranger, you know, arranged for a lot of stuff that's on PBS, a lot of stuff like PJ Martin and different people like that. Really good arranger. And Michael Palera used to play with Buddy Rich, and he's like a real staple in New Orleans piano for sure.
So what's it like, you know, so you're a professional with about 10 years of experience as, you know, playing in church and playing a million things. And from a technical level, or just from any level, was it unlearning bad habits? Was it learning new habits? I mean, like, how much of a challenge for you was it just in terms of sitting at the piano?
Well, they kind of, for me with the piano, it was kind of, at least in the jazz aspect, it was like, okay, this is what I can play. I will show you what it is that you're playing. That was Peter's total approach. It was just like, all right, you're playing this chord, Sullivan. Do you know what this chord is? And I'm like, no, I have no idea what chord this is. And he would give me the name of it. He would tell me how chords are spelled. And then, you know, and that's kind of how I was introduced to like music theory and things like that. As far as classical music, it wasn't like she didn't really build from the ground up. She kind of corrected like a few little things. And yeah. And then from there, it just kind of, and then just watching her and watching other piano players. I remember I was the type of person that was like a kind of like people stalker. So I would hear classical pianists play, and I would sit and listen by them or watch them play through the practice room window. Or if the classical piano player, the main classical teacher wasn't busy, and I had a question, I would just go to him and be like, man, how do you play an E flat scale in 2 octaves? Just show it to me. You're like, you got it? Say, okay, go ahead and practice it. You know, things like that. You know, I was always very, very nosy, and still am today about, you know, how people practice. their processes.
You know, at many of the conservatories today, even the ones that have jazz programs, you know, it's still really like lane A and lane B. You know what I mean? There's the classical players, there's the jazz players, and
Mm-hmm.
every so often there's somebody who does both. What was it like at NOCA?
Yeah, it was definitely a dividing line. It was
Mm-hmm.
definitely a dividing line. I remember there was always like, every Friday we would have performance classes, and sometimes we would rotate. You know, jazz musicians would start first, and the classical musicians would start and would go after us, and vice versa. But I always felt that there was a divide, because there would be times where the classical musicians had their part of the performance class upstairs, and then the jazz musicians would have their part of the performance class downstairs. And it would be like, well, why can't the jazz musicians play the same piano as the classical musicians? It's because the jazz musicians had a different technique than the classical musicians. And then we would break the pianos or throw the pianos out of tune, which was never the case. And you know what I mean? As a matter of fact, I find that classical musicians bang a lot harder than jazz musicians, for sure. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there was always a dividing line. Maybe my sophomore year of high school, Mr. Kirk gave me a few albums of some older guys. Because before then, I had learned the whole theme from Blow Up. Herbie Hancock was like the first album that I got in jazz on recommendation. And then I remember getting the essentials of Duke Ellington. You know what I mean? They have this compilation disc of like Duke Ellington songs. And, you know what I mean? And Giant Steps was the first jazz piece that I had ever learned. And I had to learn it in 5 minutes. So, so after I learned the song, I went and got the album. So Giant Steps. But I only had like about 4 or 5 albums of jazz, and I really didn't like it until my sophomore year when Mr. Kirk gave me Concert by the Sea by Errol Garner. And that was my introduction to my love for jazz, for sure, because it was just so happy, and it was something that I could relate to in gospel, because gospel music is very happy. You know, it's a very happy music. And the way something about Errol's playing and his feeling and his beat and just his sound was, and that recording in particular was just happy, and it reminded me of church. And yeah.
It's hard to listen to I'll Remember April without
oh man,
without smile, you know, just without feeling better.
You can't listen to any track on that album and not smile. Even ballads, even like the way he plays Autumn Leaves on there, it's just like you can't help but smile at that stuff even now.
So did you have, you know, at this point in the high school years, are you starting to have a couple of buddies, a couple of friends with whom either you're playing more or like starting to develop a musical relationship, or does that come later? Or
oh yeah, for sure. By freshman year was, like I said, I had Christian Scott and people like Chris Royal and Calvin Johnson and Calvin Turner and a lot of friends, and Troy Trombone Shorty Andrews. We had ear training together. People like that. My sophomore year was when Jonathan Baptiste came. And me and Jonathan used to practice. We used to have Oscar Peterson contests with each other, maybe the end of sophomore and junior year. We were just kind of like, okay, let's go in the practice room and let's play Body and Soul. Let's see who can sound the most like Oscar. You know what I mean? Just things like that. Mm-hmm.
At this point, is it in the back of your head or your parents' head that like music might be a career for you? Or is that already set in stone? Or no, it's not?
It wasn't. As a matter of fact, I graduated from NOCA a year earlier than I was supposed to. So they skipped me a level because they needed a piano player to fill in for level 2. So I came in not knowing anything about music and music theory as a level 2 student. And then, so I was by the time my junior year came, I was level 4. And I decided, based off my dad, like, being, you're not going into music, you're going to go into medicine. So I left the school early and started really trying to focus on science classes at the high school that I was going to, McDonald 35, while still playing for the choir there. But I didn't really think of it until, I didn't think that I was really going to pursue that music thing until the end of my senior year. I was like, this science stuff is not working for me. I really want to try music. Because by then I was looking at Jonathan, and Jonathan was doing gigs all over the school. All my friends were playing gigs all over town in New Orleans, and I wanted to be a part of that scene, but I couldn't, you know.
What was the relationship between high school and NOCA? When did you find, what did your day look like? I mean, how was this?
Okay, so the first half of the day, so from like 8:10 to like noon, was academic high school, was McDonough 35. And then we would take a bus at around 12:15 to New Orleans Center for Creative Arts, which was like 10 minutes away from my academic high school. So we did half a day there and a half a day at NOCA. Yeah.
So your life is, in those years, it's just a very, very active life. You know, the academic school in the morning, the NOCA. Did your parents have to drive you back and forth every day?
Oh yeah, every day. Every day. My mom was a soldier, man. My mom had I remember like my freshman and sophomore year, my mom would drop all three of her kids at three different schools. You know what I mean? And then go to work. And then her work day would end at like about 5:15, 5:30. And then she would pick me up from NOCA and we'd drive all the way back to LaPlace. And every day that was like 5:30 a.m. get up, you know, it's just like, and I still to this day don't know how my mom did it. I really don't.
You talked about Jonathan and others like doing a lot of gigs and you wanted to get into that scene. So is there a time like during the high school years when actually like you're starting to do non-church actual work out there playing and getting paid and going to a nightclub and all that stuff?
My sophomore year, I think I had my first gig at a jazz club with Mr. Kurt and his band. It was at Snug Harbor, actually. It's one of my first gigs, like at a club. And my mom was like, oh no, I'm not having my son play in no clubs. But it ended up working out fine. She was there and they served food there. So it wasn't like people were drinking and smoking all day and climbing on stage and all of the stigma that people have about musicians who play in clubs because of what they see on television. None of that was there. And I also remember like around the summers during that time, I was beginning to go to like jazz camps. So I would actually, that was the first time I actually flew on a plane by myself, you know, like sophomore year of high school. And actually, I think that's the first time I ever was on an airplane.
Where did you go?
I went to Skidmore. I went to Skidmore Jazz Institute, and then the summer after that, I believe, was Vail. I did Vail Jazz, and that was a real awakening going to Vail. Yeah, my roommate was Marcus Gilmore. Marcus was my roommate. Gerald was there. Who was Gerald? Gerald Clayton was the other pianist.
Right.
So like hearing him after only playing jazz for a year and he had grew up in it was like, okay, so I guess this is how I'm supposed to play if I didn't have the background that I had.
I remember hearing him very early, you know, I guess his dad's John Clayton and all that. And he could really do an Oscar thing. I mean, he could do all that. And people who maybe hear him now don't know that that's in there, but he came out of that. Right.
He was Oscar. He was Benny Green. He was, oh man. He was just like, he was like one of those kind of like straight Monty Alexander, just swinging straight up and down, hardcore swing kind of Oscar Peterson type piano player.
So what's it like for you? So you're coming into these situations and what can you what struck you? What did you learn? What was easy? What was difficult? What was a challenge? What was?
The easiest thing for me in those days, which is probably the same now, is just learning tunes. By then, I was just like, I would pick up songs by the way people were playing them, and I would just be able to play them back after like 2 hearings. And so I learned a lot of standards that way. I learned, and people were starting to give me like people kind of pull me over to the side and tell me a lot of things, Like you need to think about this when you play this, or don't play that, play this. Or, you know, so things like that was starting to kind of stick, and I would just kind of like, you know, kind of develop that way.
Before we leave those early years in New Orleans, I'd like to ask you this, which is that some people, when they hear about, you know, how New Orleans is like such a separate place, it could almost be like a state of its own. And on the one hand, it seems like, well, you know, back when Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton and the 1920s and that ancient history, which is now just about 100 years ago, that it had this thing. And then people talk about, well, you want to know something? In many ways, or at least maybe pre-Katrina, and I'd like to ask you about that too, because I'd like to see how you understand it. That it really was, in a sense, musically the same place. It's a different part of a century. It's different things have happened in music, but the equation of it is kind of the same. And is that true? Is it not?
I would say when I went, I didn't realize how like special New Orleans was until I left to go to college. And I was like, wait, you guys, y'all, when y'all at the dinner table, y'all just eat, y'all don't sing. You know what I mean? There's nobody banging on the table. There's nobody dancing. Y'all don't have a parade season. Y'all don't have like holidays during parade season time where we go in marching parades and we dance and we party and we sing and we have a good time. Like music doesn't play that much of an importance in like a day-to-day living kind of society. Not just that, but y'all don't put a lot of emphasis on food like that. You know what I mean? Like I would go to lunch and just see people eat like these big plates of rice, just plain rice, and just eat. I was like, you're not gonna put nothing on the rice. Like, you know, like that's a little weird, you know what I mean? And you know, the way people talk, I mean, and the whole culture, you know, if I say hello to you, you're supposed to say hello back. You know what I mean? It's just like, I guess it's a Southern kind of friendly kind of way of communicating that I kind of missed when I moved up north. They'll be like, hey, and people look at you like you're crazy because you're talking to them. I'm just saying hello. I didn't, you know.
Now you mentioned going to college, and that would have been just around the time of Katrina, if I have my dates right.
It was. I graduated from high school and started college in 2004. Katrina hit in 2005. How
did college come? And what were you thinking of, and where did you apply to, and what?
Let's see. I applied to Xavier University of New Orleans for pre-med and got in on a full scholarship, and then decided that I didn't want to do that at all.
So your grades must have been superlative.
Oh yeah, I was the valedictorian of my senior class.
Okay.
So at the last minute, I decided I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to do medicine. I wanted to do music. My dad cried. He was like, "You're gonna be broke. You're not gonna make any money." I said, "You sure this is what you want to do?" I said, "Daddy, this is what I want to do." He said, "Well, I'm cutting you completely off. If you decide to do this, you are on your own. Wow. Financially, you're on your own." I was like, "Okay, I'll take the risk." So I applied to Berklee College of Music, and I applied to Oberlin Conservatory of Music. Berklee put me on the waiting list because by that time, those were the only two schools that had late applications. You can send an application in May. You know what I mean? So Berklee put me on the waiting list. Oberlin, the piano teacher, heard me because I sent in a videotape to both of them, and I didn't know any rhythm changes here, so I just played the Flintstones. And he was like, "You actually played the Flintstones on your audition tape for Oberlin Conservatory." I was like, "Okay, whatever." And he was like, "I like you." So he accepted me on a scholarship, and I went to Oberlin. I didn't know anything about the school. I didn't know anything about the credentials of Oberlin. I didn't even know the teacher I was studying with, the teachers that were there. It was just the music school that I applied to based on a friend of mine named Courtney Bryan, who went there. And and then that was a huge culture shock, but it was also probably one of the best things that I could have ever done, for sure.
Well, let's talk about both things. Let's talk about the culture shock.
Well, it's in the Midwest, in the middle of the cornfields. You know, it's like about 30 or 45 minutes away from Cleveland. So, I mean, Cleveland is kind of like, if Cleveland is kind of like the only major city that's around there, it's kind of rough. Because Cleveland, there's not really a whole lot happening in Cleveland. Cleveland's a cool city, but there's not really a whole lot happening, especially musically. So, I mean, and then it was the first time I had been around people from different countries, from different parts of America. I mean, because growing up in New Orleans, you just think that all there is New Orleans. You know what I mean? So when you start meeting people from, like, I don't know, Kalamazoo, you start meeting people from, like, the Bay Area in California, meet actual New Yorkers who go to school, you know what I mean? And or you meet people from Seattle, you know what I mean? It's just like all of these, and then you meet people from China and Japan, and you know what I mean, from all over the world coming to Oberlin to study music and liberal arts. You know, it's just like you're getting a whole lot of information at one time from like both sides, and you're learning how sheltered you've been. You know, for me, I mean, my parents were very, very protective of us. And there were a lot of things that I learned my first year of school. I mean, I met my first atheist at Oberlin. I met my first LGBTQ person at Oberlin. You know what I mean? I met all of these different people and all of these different ways of thinking, and all of this. It really, really messed me up, you know, coming from a really conservative background and Black Baptist church, you know what I mean? It's like, whoa, wait, they're actually people who don't believe what I believe, and I have to actually work with them and get along with them and make this work? Okay, here we go.
And they probably had the same challenge with you.
Oh, totally. They hated me. You
really?
believe that? Are you crazy? Oh, God. You know what I mean? Yeah. I was introduced to people who were on drugs, people who having sex everywhere, and I was just like, oh my God, everybody's going to hell except me. And then I was like, no. Then I started surrounding myself with people, and they really made me question a lot of things. It made me become a little bit more open and more loving and more open. Just being a much more well-rounded individual with a brain that thinks, rather than somebody thinking for me, you know.
So what was it like? So you're there, you're a freshman, you're on your own. What's the music experience like? And
I walked through the doors of the conservatory and was just looking around at people that was practicing. And the first people that I heard play the trumpet was Theo Croker, Donald Malloy. And Theo ended up being like my older brother. He really looked out for me. He really taught me a lot about music. He taught me a lot about just how to run a band and how to run band rehearsals. I mean, it was just, I remember learning a lot from the students over at Oberlin, you know what I mean? And then the teachers, I mean, Marcus Belgrave, Billy Hart, Gary Bartz, Robert Eubanks, Peter Dominguez, Dan Wall, who was my teacher. They're just like an all-star like cast of musicians that taught there. And I was like, I don't know any of these people. I mean, Marcus Belgrave with Ray Charles, Gary Bartz with Miles Davis. And I was like, Gary played with Miles? It's like, are you crazy? Of course he played with Miles. Among other people, you know what I mean? It was funny when I went back to New Orleans and told my old teachers who I was studying with. They was like, I would kill to study with Gary Bartz. Are you crazy? And you have him there every week? You better, yeah.
Let's just stop there for a moment and let's talk about those two men and about what it was like either studying or learning music from them. How did they go about it? I mean, Marcus, you know, on top of his trumpet playing, you know, a legendary figure, kind of like a Pied Piper, just a guy who for years just gave himself up to his community and to the people that he taught. And Gary Bartz, like a major figure back from the 60s till today, just in the greatest festivals and gigs, just a great elder, international elder type. And I hate to say elder because he's so young in spirit.
Right. Oh yeah.
He's like Roy Haynes, like the youngest guy in the room.
Yeah, I have a lot of memories with them. Studying with those people weren't just because I never really had a class with them. I had a class with Marcus, improv, advanced improv. But a lot of the lessons would sometimes just be me walking in their room while they're giving a lesson to somebody and being like, Sullivan, you know this tune? I'm like, no, here, we're going to teach it to you. You're going to play it. So I would end up playing for the lessons. And then while they're playing and they're giving them lessons, they would tell me things. You know what I mean? Or it would be some times where we would just like, Sullivan, what are you doing now? I said, well, I have a class with you right now, Marcus. We're getting ready to go to improv. He said, let's go to Cleveland. So he would ditch his own class and he would drive. Me and him and he couldn't see all that well at all. So we'd be all veering off on the side of the road doing this. And he's lighting a joint and we're talking all the way up to Cleveland. We get to the Siam Cafe, we order food, and we drive back. And that would be our lesson. We would just sit and drive, and I would ask him questions. He would tell me stories. And I would ask him. I remember taking trumpet lessons with him one time. Yeah, it was pretty wild, man. It was, I mean, those kinds of experiences, it's one thing to be able to get, the quick and easy way to play over this chord or how to look at this tune, but it's another thing to actually see musicians and see their lifestyle and see their personal relationship to not just music, but to the musicians that you love. I asked Marcus, I said, what was the one thing that surprised you about Ray Charles that would probably surprise a lot of other people who didn't know him? He told me, he said, Ray Charles was a hell of an auto mechanic. He said the one time the bus broke down, their tour bus broke down, and Ray Charles, I guess, was driving. I guess he had a separate car, but he noticed, I think he was behind the bus, and he noticed that the bus had broke down. So he pulled over, popped the hood of the bus, fixed a couple of things. The bus ran fine the rest of the tour. I was like, how did they say? But he couldn't see. He said, exactly. I still to this day don't know how the hell he did that. Yeah.
It sounds as though almost like the education, well, not almost, that it was more like what it would have been like if you'd been around the days when guys were in bands together. That's not so much classes from 9 to 10 in the morning and A, B, C, D, E, F. It was more like the music as a reflection of the life.
That's right. And because I was that nosiness from high school was kind of preserved, I would just find these people. And I would, like, if they were in the middle of a lesson with somebody, I'd just walk in and just sit and look at them.
Well, this explains to me now why you came up and played the piano at the Jazz Museum that night on Body and Soul.
Right. I'm just that nosy.
I wouldn't call it nosy. I'd call it curious and interested. We're also talking about Gary Bartz, and I'm wondering if you can just give us an insight into just something about Gary at Oberlin and you.
Gary came to Oberlin. He would come like the beginning of the week. So it'd be like Monday through Wednesday would be Gary's days. So if Gary was there, he would be there like during that slot. And I remember the first time I actually met him formally, Theo had organized a gig for his quintet, special guest, Gary Bartz, at Nighttown in Cleveland. So Gary stops me in the hallway and he's like, hey, so I hear we're going to be playing together. I'm looking forward to hearing you. And I was like, oh, well, I'm looking forward to playing with you, I guess. And he was like, do you know someone to watch over me? And I said, no, I don't know that. And he said, well, learn it because I'm going to play that as a ballad. And my introduction to hearing Gary Bartz was on that gig playing that tune. And it would, and I'll never forget. He also took a solo on Sonny Rollins' Pinup House. I'll never. That's sometimes you hear somebody play, and it's like etched in your brain, like to the point where like you remember exactly what they look like, exactly what they played when they played it. That's what that solo. That was the first time I ever experienced that on a solo, and that was with Gary Bartz. And from that, I was like, wow, this is probably one of the greatest saxophone players alive, you know. I worked in the dining halls for my freshman year. And then I was able to pick up a church gig. I started playing at a church in Oberlin, Mount Zion. So that kind of helped cover the rest of the expenses that I had. My dad didn't really bite until my junior year, after my junior recital, which was interesting. He came to my junior recital and he was like, okay, my son's junior recital is happening today. Let me go and sit in wherever the auditorium is. And he said maybe 15 minutes before the thing was packed, there was people like outside the windows and like in the hallways he had the hallway with the door open and people sitting out in the hallway listening to the concert. It was like, wow, they listen. Who they come here to listen to? What is that? And said, they come to listen to your son. Somebody said that. So by then he was like, okay, well, maybe there's something there for him. I'll give him a try. Maybe he did do the right thing by being a musician. Mm-hmm. Oberlin was in a lot of ways kind of like a boot camp for me. And it was a good preparation for New York. I don't think I would have survived as a human being and as a musician in New York if I didn't have that experience at Oberlin. I needed that small space to kind of, because when I got to Oberlin, I almost had to relearn how to play the piano. I had started to develop a whole lot of bad habits with my technique. I had forgotten all kinds of things with theory, and Oberlin was a good boot camp for that. It was just a good preparation. That was when I really became really studied with people like Bill Evans and people like Keith Jarrett who was like a major influence for me back in those days, and Chick Corea, and it was like that era for me. I just remember like learning a lot of music from Wynton, learning a lot of Wynton's music because Theo was Wynton heavy. It prepared me to play with Roy because the way Theo ran his band, and he even played a lot of Roy's music.
Roy Hargrove, yes.
Oh yeah. I started playing with some singers there, so it got me introduced to it. It was like a real boot camp experience for me.
Well, Sullivan, this has been wonderful. The time has just flown, so if you'd agree to come back for a part 2, that's great. We'll just pick it up where we're dropping off. So thank you very much for your time. This has been really enjoyable. And that concludes part 1 of a 2-part interview with pianist Sullivan Fortner. This has been Harlem Speaks, one of the many online programs offered by the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. My name is Lauren Schoenberg. I'm the senior scholar at the museum. You can find out more about what we offer at our website, www.jmih.org, at our Facebook page, also on our YouTube channel, where many of these interviews ultimately live. On behalf of the staff, our board, our volunteers, everyone at the museum, we want to thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again.